Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a production for use podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 169, an unofficial history of comedy in American cinema, part 2, the screwballs.
Yeah, we went from something that's all silent to something that's all about the words.
And
specifically, how many words, how many jokes per minute can you throw in there?
Yeah.
It really is, in a lot of ways, the predecessor to other high-energy comedy formats like the skit show. I don't think you could have something like SNL if you don't have screwballs.
I can see that.
Certainly, they both seem to be powered by enough of the disco sugar to kind of have reached the same energy level. But it is a very different turn, but it's also a very significant turn in the history of comedy. So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit more about screwballs.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you, Alex, how would you define screwball to someone who is like generally familiar with film or like kind of just getting into film history and film buff genres?
I feel like screwballs are kind of the pinnacle of the transatlantic accent. And a lot of classical Hollywood is kind of formatted around them. So
That's
I think
Cary Grant is the poster boy.
Especially Cary Grant. He's in so many of them. And a lot of other very famous actors and actresses from that era. Katharine Hepburn's in quite a few. A lot of them are directed by very famous directors. I think all three directors we're talking about today are some of like the mega famous directors who I believe we've done an episode on every single one of them by now.
Yeah, it's going to be a good review episode.
So this is like the height of classical Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, even into the 50s to a bit. Comedy starts to change again quite a bit once there's color introduced. And I don't mean like comedy color, I mean like color. Because a lot of screwball is playing with the idea that suddenly you can hear the words that are being said. And you can tell jokes like you would in person all of a sudden. And it becomes this very clever, almost like how clever can you be? How much innuendo can you pack into a short time frame? You know, all of that sort of thing put together into one go with the high octane, high production value of classical Hollywood, all packed into very simple sets in a way. Like there's typically not a lot of over the top physical comedy in them. Sometimes there is, but a lot of the times it's very contained, almost like a very contained stage play in a lot of ways, a very much kind of almost a 3-camera setup in a lot of these cases, and just straight up dialogue, wall to wall dialogue. How fast can we go? Including like the classic stereotypes of like the fast talking reporter, which is basically built around His Girl Friday. There are other ones, but His Girl Friday is probably the best example of it. And so that's, everybody who's watched any sort of movie or TV show has probably come across one of these tropes from Screwball that's been put into a more modern version or sample of it. But now we're going to get into the deep origin of that stereotype that you may be familiar with. But, where did it come from? What are the best examples of it? Why is it significant?
Yeah. And this is a big shift. And like we mentioned last time, like as soon as sound hit Hollywood ran with it. And that's what we're going to see here. Like once they could start like writing dialogue and stuff like that, they started writing these really intricate plots. They would steal from theater. They would take whatever they could to just work that dialogue, and then we start getting these stars. And we had stars in the silent Hollywood, but you had to have a whole new kind of charisma in the talkies. So looking at the Wikipedia definition of screwball comedy, there's a couple of interesting distinctions that is brought up there. So I think it'll be interesting to look for those as we go through these movies. But Wikipedia says that screwball comedy is a subgenre of romantic comedy that satirizes the traditional love story. It has secondary characteristics similar to film noir, which incidentally, every film we're covering this time is a crime film, which was not intentional. Distinguished by a female character who dominates the relationship with the male central character. A lot of times true, not always true. whose masculinity is challenged, and the two engage in a humorous battle of the sexes. What sets screwball comedy apart from the generic romantic comedy is that screwball comedy puts the emphasis on a funny spoofing of love, while more traditional romantic comedy ultimately accents love. So there's this element of the love story almost becomes a MacGuffin to get through plots and situational comedy and stuff like that. Whereas if you're looking at a traditional rom-com, they take the romance in those very seriously. Here, it's kind of the romance is almost a joke in itself, which kind of sets it apart. And also just the term screwball, it came straight from baseball. You throw a pitch that goes in an unexpected direction. So obviously there's lots of twists and turns in these movies. Things happen that are unexpected, but also it would be used to describe an odd player or someone who behaves unexpectedly. And so a lot of these films have characters who are, they're not usually focused around the everyman. They're focused around characters who have something different about them. We're going to see some, but also in the timeline, screwballs start getting prominence in the early 30s, and they thrived from the 30s through to the 50s. And the last film that we're talking about today is one of the last kind of classical screwballs from 1959. But that period, the 30s through the 50s, is the exact time period that the Hays Code, the production code, was in effect in Hollywood, which had very strict moral guidelines on what could be presented and displayed within your films. And so these comedies, which are romantic comedies, which are spoofing love, which are oftentimes basically sex comedies or satyr plays, like we talked about a little bit last time, or maybe we brought it up in the tragedy series. But you couldn't show any of the sex. You couldn't show anything too risky or raunchy. You couldn't push boundaries all that much, which is a big part of what comedy is. And so, like Alex was saying, these films got really, really good at hinting at what was actually going on behind the scenes without being able to actually show anything, which in a lot of cases actually makes the films better because they leave a lot of fill in the blanks for the audience. And it pushed a lot of these directors to become the kind of masters that they are. Like, that's Ernst Lubitsch's whole legacy, is just implying half of the story of his films, which we're going to see some of that today. And yeah, like I said, these all happen to be crime films. And I thought it was interesting that Wikipedia said that screwball comedies share a lot of characteristics with noir, which I never really thought of before, but there is a lot of overlap. And some of these are basically just noir films that don't take themselves very seriously.
Yeah, I could see that. You know, I think it's funny that we're talking about a type of movie that couldn't show something and therefore had to be really clever. But nowadays, so much stuff is made that isn't working around the idea that they can't show something because they can show anything, but rather working around the idea that your audience more than likely won't be visually engaged with what you're watching because they're backgrounding it on a streaming service. And so you have to kind of write in all of the action into the dialogue as well, which has been a noticeable change in how things are written over the past 10 years or so, to make it all consumable as background noise. So
the multi-screen effect.
Yes. So I think it works well enough for YouTube videos, which have basically become like podcasts of a sort. But for movies, it's a very big change from here, where you kind of could count on people's undivided attention in the movie theater. So again, a very different format of movie making compared to the kind of setup we have today, where you're basically going to be half listening until the CGI cutscene plays, and then suddenly you snap to and go, ooh, ah, and then go back to half listening.
Yeah.
That's my pessimistic hot take for the day.
Well, no, it's a good point, because that was in Frank Capra's autobiography. He talks about, like, a big part of his philosophy of filmmaking was you have your audience trapped in a dark room for 2 hours, like, make it worth it for them. And that is not the case anymore.
Yeah, no.
Anyway, what are the films we're talking about today, Alex?
Well, today we're going to start off with Trouble in Paradise from 1932, directed by the one, the only director Ernst Lubitsch, written by Samson Raffleson, Grover Jones, and Ernst Lubitsch himself, based on The Honest Finder, a 1931 play by Alidar Laszlo, starring Miriam Hopkins, Kay Francis, and Herbert Marshall. Cinematography by Victor Milner, and music by W. Frank Harling. Then we'll be talking about His Girl Friday from 1940, directed by the one, the only director Howard Hawks, written by Charles Lederer and Ben Hecht, who is a very famous playwright, very, very famous playwright, based on The Front Page, which is a 1928 play by famous playwright Ben Hecht, starring Cary Grant, Rosalind Russell, Ralph Bellamy, and Gene Lockhart. But honestly, mostly just Cary Grant. Cinematography by Joseph Walker. And finally, Some Like It Hot from 1959, which good luck remembering anyone in this movie besides Marilyn Monroe. Directed by the one, the only Billy Wilder. Written by the one, the only Billy Wilder. And I.A.L. Diamond, which is too many initials. You don't get that many. Stop it. Based on Fanfare of Love, the 1935 French film directed by Richard Poitier and written by Max Brunet and other human beings, starring Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon, and Marilyn Monroe. Cinematography by Charles Lang and music by Adolf Deutsch.
All right, Jason, set up Trouble in Paradise from 1932.
Trouble in Paradise from 1932. After robbing a wealthy man named Francois Philibert while disguised as a doctor in Venice, master thief Gaston Montesquieu meets pickpocket Lily, and the two fall in love and decide to team up. In Paris, Gaston steals a diamond-encrusted purse from Madame Collet, the widowed owner and heiress of a famous perfume company. When Madame Collet offers a large reward for the purse, Gaston decides to return it, and in the process, he charms her and gets hired as her personal secretary. Now, with access to Madame Collet's safe and her confidence, Gaston hires Lily as his assistant, and the two make plans for another cash robbery when the time is right. However, tensions rise as Gaston insinuates himself into the life and heart of Madame Collet under the jealous watch of Lily. And Francois Philibert, who happens to be a persistent but unrequited suitor to Madame Collet, decides he's pretty sure he's seen Gaston somewhere before.
A lot of times people consider It Happened One Night to be the original screwball comedy, which we talked about when we did our Frank Capra episode many, many moons ago. But really, Trouble in Paradise, I think, sets up a lot of the tropes that Frank Capra just popularized more. I don't know why Lubitsch was not quite as popular as some of the other directors in his day. He was underneath all the directors that got really popular, but Lubitsch wasn't so much. But he set up all of those tropes in his films, and this one is one of the best examples of those.
I think part of what you're seeing there, Jonathan, is a bit of a bias of our perspective. I think Lubitsch's films were popular in their day, but he wasn't as popular because we didn't have the public focus on directors that we did. He was popular within the world of filmmakers. Everyone was very excited about him and very excited to see his movies. And a lot of his fellow filmmakers were excited to see what he made and copied what he did, like what you're talking about. But a lot of our perspective on famous filmmakers comes from like the French New Wave and the directors they studied, which happened to be a generation removed from Lubitsch. As a sort, I think he died relatively young, so his oeuvre didn't last too long. Another side effect, and I think a very good example of this is Frank Capra. But a lot of directors from this area who are known to some extent between us, our generation, and our parents' generation, are famous because their movies got a lot of play in syndication. Yeah. And those movies were the movies that came out in the 40s. And a very, very good example is Frank Capra's, it's the Christmas movie. Yeah. It's a Wonderful Life, which wasn't that popular when it came out, although it was very good. But it became super duper popular and a Christmas classic in syndication on television. So a lot of what we remember about who is famous and who isn't is biased not necessarily about what's good and what's bad, but by what gets seen. It's the same reason that people sometimes gush about the newest TV show on the streaming services being the best thing ever. And it could be, it could not be. But a lot of the bias is the fact that there are a lot of people talking about it. And there's a lot of people, some of whom have been paid to say that it's really, really good. And there's a lot of chatter about that going on.
Well, it's a good point too, because like when it comes to syndication many decades later, Frank Capra is a much easier sell to do reruns of on TV than Ernst Lubitsch, German expat making movies set a lot of times during World War II, and also who has a lot of innuendos in his film. Like Frank Capra is a very patriotic kind of a plug, and
he's very wholesome.
Yeah, so yeah, that makes sense that he would get more screen time. But the things that Lubitsch sets up in this film are going to set the stage for a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about. Like we have Herbert Marshall here starts getting that witty banter going. Like there's so many moments where he'll just cut people off with a quick witty remark and just basically distract them from their train of thought, which is basically the entire plot of His Girl Friday. There's Lubitsch's famous doors opening and closing, and we have men and women characters going in one door, out another door, and the butlers all turning and scratching their head like, what's going on behind that door there? There's love triangle. The love triangle that we have going on here is great. So all of these things are getting established, and they're going to get even further brought out in the later films that we're going to watch.
Yeah, they set it up very nicely with a drama in the relationships and the character arcs. So people are torn between what they want and what they want. In this one specifically, it's less about what they want and what they need, and maybe more about what they wanted in the past versus what they want now, and trying to let go of old commitments in order to replace them with new ones, or vice versa. And
it's
then,
a little
of
bit,
course,
you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Yes, and
or
then
you can't
of course
have two cakes.
It's set up very nicely with the crime drama and the Chekhov's gun of one of the characters who's eventually going to recognize the criminal. But it takes like the whole movie, and then
guy,
with that structure. Oh, he's from all of the Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire movies.
Yes, he was in that. He was also in Arsenic and Old Lace, but he's in several Lubitsch films too, but he's always like the sad sack rejected lover who's just pathetic, but he's so funny in that role.
He was paid a lot of money to do that. So, hey, he's a great, phenomenal character actor.
He does great. It's just so funny that he's always that one who's like really wants to be with the girl, but then she is always going to go with the other suave young guy.
But yes, essentially the secret to making a really good, the first step, I guess, of making a really good screwball comedy is to have those nice dramatic setups that are not they're just complicated enough to where you could see there's going to be a problem, but not so convoluted, not high concept convoluted, just complicated enough to create issues. And then once you have that structure, you just put all the written jokes you can into almost like what becomes almost in a lot of these a series of skits more than it becomes a fluent plot. A lot of times, in a
sense, I feel like these are more fluid than some other.
They certainly are. Like on the spectrum of something that's purely anthological to something that's purely plot driven. This is definitely on the plot driven side of that, but it's not on the farthest side of that. Like a lot of the scenes you could drop from the movie, and I don't think it would change a lot. There's like a few key scenes that are very important, and then a lot of them are kind of just like playing with the characters and playing with the setup.
Yes. But on the other hand, I will say that there are not a lot of these scenes that you could take out of the film and they would stand on their own. And that's what I think of when I think of skit driven. Like in the silent films, like Harold Lloyd, you can take out the building climbing scene, and that could be its own like two-reeler, basically. But in these films, like especially with Ernst Lubitsch and some of these early ones, when I was researching this, I ended up on some Reddit thread, and someone was like new to older films or something, and was like, I just don't get Trouble in Paradise. Like, it's not that funny. It's not like they weren't familiar with the style of comedy. But if you are kind of tuned in and you kind of know what Lubitsch is going for, it's hilarious. Like, there are so many things that is just like snuck in there, and it's just Lubitsch being cheeky. But it's not like ha funny, or it's not like someone gets slapped in the face and that's hilarious. It's like just subtle lines and intentions behind those lines that is what drives the interest and the entertainment.
Yeah. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, there's a central idea to the story that provides structure, and without it, like, the setup of every scene is lost. Like, you wouldn't understand it. But within that, a lot of it just becomes play to an extent of how much can we play with these concepts in this scene, which that essence of fun and play and wordplay and nothing being too serious at any given moment makes Screwballs very fun. There's enough dramatic tension, but it's enjoyable because it's a comedy. So they set up the dramatic tension of secrets being kept or hidden identity, which is hidden identity is a similar theme in both Trouble in Paradise and Some Like It Hot. But the dramatic tension of finding out, when's the shoe gonna drop, provides a bunch of laughs rather than a bunch of tears like in tragedies.
So all three of these are love triangle films, and probably I would probably say that a majority of screwball comedies end up being love triangles in some way or other, just because it's rife for that kind of situational comedy. But I think it's interesting to watch the dynamics through each of these, because I think in this one, it's one of the only ones we're going to see today that there isn't like one character who necessarily has an upper hand on the other ones. There's like maybe Madame Collet does a little bit, but ultimately they set up this circumstance and it only has one like real clean conclusion. And so we're moving towards that. So we have Gaston comes in and he pretends to seduce Madame Collet so that he can get to her money. And then he brings in Lily to be his assistant. And so you know that ultimately, you know, he's got to end up with one of them. And at some point, the tension's going to build and rise. And he is a criminal. And so he can't necessarily end up with the heiress of the large fortune. So you can pretty much just assume from the beginning that he's going to end up with Lily again by the end. But getting through the whole thing, you know, Madame Collet pulls a lot of strings because she ends up actually kind of seducing Gaston himself, and he's kind of fighting that and trying to keep his mind on the target. And so the balances kind of keep going back and forth. Whereas in some of the other films that we're going to see, there's like there's oftentimes one character who's pulling a lot of the strings and kind of manipulating the situation. But in this one, it's really well balanced and it really kind of flows naturally to its conclusion.
Yeah, you know who I was thinking about while I was watching this movie?
What?
Pierre Desparie. And it had me thinking that...
You want to clarify that?
Pierre Desparie, or Despereaux, as I think it's actually pronounced, is the role played by Carrie Yules in the hit TV show Psych, which is one of Jonathan and I's favorite TV shows from when we were growing up. Still is one of my favorite TV shows, probably. It's like my comfort show. If I just need to like chill, Psych is going on. I have the whole thing on DVD. And I was thinking that Psych has major elements of Screwball to it.
I didn't think about that, but you're totally right. And
it's mixed in with crime. I think the other big thing that doses into it is a little bit of comedy of the absurd in spaces, and the comedy of pulp culture references. But before it got obsessively annoying, before like the last couple seasons of Community drove it into the ground, and Marvel really just went ham with it. So yeah, it's I think it counts in the screwball category, but I think it's also my enjoyment of Psych is one of the reasons why I enjoy Screwballs so much as well. I like things that are witty and fast and complicated and keep me engaged and mentally stimulated. I think there is something to be said to being constantly mentally stimulated. I mean, these guys switch gears between jokes faster than you can scroll through TikToks. So like there is something innate in the human brain that sometimes we just want a lot of stimulation really fast in quick succession that's going to tickle our funny bone. The nice thing about it being packaged up in a screwball is that it's contained and it has a set runtime, so you don't end up doom scrolling screwballs forever.
Or binge watching them for 9 seasons.
You would fall apart. I would fall apart. There was a binge watching era where I thought it was fun, and it's just not. Also, I'm doing work and school right now, and that's just no. I don't have time. Who has time?
Yeah, but to your point earlier about like, Lubitsch is making films knowing that an audience is sitting there watching them. So there are a lot of jokes that are purely visual. And some of them aren't even so much jokes as they're just... A lot of
side-eye.
There's a lot of side-eye. But there's also scenes like right before Madame Collet goes to her party and leaves Gaston at the house, and she's like teasing him and taunting him, like, I'll be back at 11, be ready for me. And she says something like, we're going to have days and months and years together, and every time she says a different time period, it cuts to a different shot of the room, but in every shot you can see the characters and you can see the bed. And Ernst Lubitsch is like, he's telling you what they're saying without using the words, and you have to be watching the film to understand what he's talking about.
Years, my God, woman.
But she was whew. But yeah, that's how Lubitsch builds his stories. And even just like keeping track of the time of when people are out and when they're gone and when they sat down on a couch, and then cutting to a clock, and then it goes like forward 2 hours, and then they get up off the couch and you're like, okay. So that's how Lubitsch do. That's the Lubitsch touch. And this is the film that really kind of got people started talking about the Lubitsch touch. And it's fairly early in his I mean, he did some silent films and stuff, but it's one of his early sound films. And
32 is very early in the sound era too.
Yeah.
You can tell like the mixing isn't 100% like polished in this one. Like it becomes like people are used to now, which isn't a bad thing. It's just a clear demarcator of being from pre 1935.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of our chronology of films that we're building out in these time blocks, Trouble in Paradise came out the year before Duck Soup. So we're even kind of overlapping our timeline here a bit.
Yeah. It definitely very different comedies though. Very different.
Yeah. Again, Duck Soup is that sketch comedy style where you can take the jokes out. You could take out an entire scene. Like just the mirror scene is 2 minutes that you can watch on its own.
I forget the plot of Duck Soup.
It doesn't matter.
As I watch Duck Soup.
It doesn't matter. Yeah. The last thing I want to say about Trouble in Paradise is also related to the time period. 1932 is just like 4 or 5 years post Great Depression. So a lot of the early screwball comedies, like even It Happened One Night, My Man Godfrey is also touted as one of the great early screwballs. They're very like class comedy centric. So it's the rich or the poor getting something up on the rich, or the rich being ridiculous or something like that, because people wanted to go to the theaters and watch someone with a bunch of money either lose it or someone without a bunch of money get a bunch of money. And so you'll see that theme in a lot of those films. It's not so much in the later films that we have on the docket today, but this one is a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, I think My Man Godfrey is very much about an unemployed tramp of sorts during
Yeah.
the Great Depression. I mean, I think it's really easy for us to forget how impactful the Great Depression was culturally.
I mean, just
kind of
imagine
got
how
washed out, but it
impactful the
lasted.
recession was for us and how much people complained about it. And that
And
was
the
a
recession
fraction
lasted like
of the
a
problem.
few years.
Yeah.
The Great Depression lasted a decade, almost more than a decade.
Yeah.
Like it didn't really end until World War II. So like 1928 to 1940. And there's a whole series of films that circle around that. I mean, hey, if you watch any Capra movie from that era too, it's very much in the same vein.
That's it happened one night. It's the same thing. The rich heiress gets stolen by the newspaper guy.
The it happened one night kind of gives me Grapes of Wrath, but what if it was funny and not depressing? Vibes like road trip during the Great Depression.
Well, yeah, I was going to bring that up later on in overall notes, but there's several comparisons here between like screwball comedies and tragedy films. That's like you just shift the tone and you can keep almost all of the plot the same. You just add some jokes and make it lighthearted.
Yeah, man. That's pretty much it. That's the secret.
All right. Well, let's move on from Trouble in Paradise to His Girl Friday. See? From 1940. Jason, take it away.
His Girl Friday from 1940. When Hildy Johnson arrives at the office of Chicago's The Morning Post to tell Walter Burns, the head editor and her ex-husband, that she is quitting to marry Bruce Baldwin, an insurance salesman, and settle down to a comfortable home life away from the hustle and bustle of investigative journalism, she winds up assigned to one last story covering the pending execution of Earl Williams, a shy white bookkeeper accused of murdering a black police officer. While Hildy is busy chasing leads, writing articles and harboring convicts, Walter spends his time keeping Bruce out of the way by various means, most of which land Bruce behind bars temporarily. As the moment of execution draws near and pressure mounts to get the real story of political corruption released to the public, Walter will stop at nothing to ensure Hildy is caught in the thrill of the newspaper game for good and all.
Okay, Alex. His Girl Friday is one of the least insinuative screwball films that I've seen. Like
They've got no time for that, Jonathan. They're busy newspapermen and women. They're on the beat, on the rag. They've got to get the scoop.
Yeah. So they've got there's so much else going on that you don't really need it. But I think it's interesting that is one of the big things that we see in a lot of the other films. But His Girl Friday is very much kind of cut and dry. She walks in to break up with him. He's like, I'm not going to let her break up with me. I'm going to keep her distracted with work forever. And they just like zero in on that. But there's no like sultriness. There's no, I mean, the whole plot takes place in the course of like 1 day or 2 days or something.
No, it's 1 day. I think it's like a few hours.
Yeah. So within that time, it's just nonstop plot and MacGuffins and Cary Grant talking so much. I think the first time I watched this, I was like, I've only caught like 50% of the words.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
The standard rule of thumb in Hollywood is like when you write a script, there's a minute of film per page of script. I think there's probably 2 pages per minute of film in this movie.
Yeah, it takes it's fast. It's really, really fast. And yeah, Jonathan, you're right. Actually interesting, just a little fun historical tidbit. No fault divorce wasn't a thing in the US until 1969. So if you're wondering why he could basically dodge a divorce in this movie by just kind of not signing the papers, it's because you had to agree to it. Yeah, I mean, technically, I think you have to actually sign the papers now.
I think they were already divorced.
Were they?
Yeah, I think at the beginning they were already divorced, and she was just coming to tell him that she was quitting her job, not necessarily coming to get anything signed.
Well, I'll let a woman divorce me, but the second she tries to quit my paper, that's when she's gone too far.
Yeah. This film has a very unhealthy ethos behind it.
It's funny because there's also it reminds me of the Philadelphia Story from 1940, which also features Cary Grant trying to get back with somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize this till I was looking it up, but comedy of remarriage was its own subgenre of screwball comedies, where two people who had been together and broken up get married again. This is not like remarrying someone else. It's like you were married and now you're not, and now you're getting married again to the same person. That happens a lot in the old screwball comedies because it's kind of the most wholesome way to do it, and that's what people wanted to see.
It's very Hollywood.
Very Hollywood. So one thing that I really like about the dialogue in this film, the dialogue itself is part of the form of the film, but it's also a plot point. Like literally the plot moves because of the way that Cary Grant's character uses words to distract and confuse every single person that he's talking to. And so it's not like jokes are just thrown in to be funny for the audience. It's like that is the personality of the character in the film, and it's the reason why the rest of the comedy happens.
Yeah, this is earlier we mentioned how some of these kind of like have very contained sets. This is a really good example of it. I think almost all of it, with a few exceptions.
There's some good branching outs.
There's some good branches out that take advantage of the fact that it's a movie, so you can do these wild cuts to other scenes. But for the most part, it's a stage play set in a newspaper office. Even the concept
that one room with the big desk and all the phone receivers.
Chekhov's desk.
Chekhov's desk, right? There's I think there's a Chekhov's gun. There's a lot of Chekhov in this film.
If you have to have a giant desk on your set, you better put someone in it by the end of the film.
And you better get it out or throw it out the window. Oh my gosh, that lady jumped out the window. I forgot about that.
Yeah, it got a little dark there for a second.
I was like, yeah, and that's the thing that I think that the
this one is like a really serious story going on. Like there's like a political uprising happening in the city.
Yeah. And there's political corruption. There's like race tension. There's a lot going on behind the scenes while these two characters are just like going back and forth about like insurance claims and whether or not they're going to honeymoon in Niagara Falls.
Yeah, they're just smothering everything else. And in fact, that whole conceit that their relatively banal problems are somehow outweighing everything else that's super serious in the background of the story is part of the humor. It kind of makes it extra ridiculous. And the fact that you're focusing on that and their dialogue rather than the political drama happening in the background is another kind of swerve or screwball thrown at the audience.
Yeah. But the other thing is that the film is about manipulation. Right? Through words. The film is about newspaper journalists and the way that they manipulate stories and public perception of things based on the amount of words that they can jam onto a page and what they're talking about. I mean, that's the whole thing with the girl who jumps out the window is that she's been slandered. That's the whole thing with the guy who's going to be executed is because they made up a story for political purposes. And so it is interesting that that's the underlying theme of the story, but it's also the form that the story takes because in the film, Cary Grant's entire purpose is to manipulate the situation through his words and his dialogue. And like I was saying before, in terms of this love triangle, Cary Grant has all of the power. Like he is in control, even though Hildy walks into the newspaper office knowing that he's going to try and get one over on her. He still ends up completely controlling the outcome of the story.
I mean, she was done the second she walked in. Like, honestly,
she shouldn't have gone there.
If she really just wanted to start a new life with some other guy, there was no need for her to go back.
Send a telegram.
Don't need to be there to quit your job. You can just leave.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to be really professional, it's a 2 weeks notice. But honestly, in this situation where your boss is your ex-husband, just leave. Like, it's just not worth it. But no, she engaged. And I think there's a reason for that. And it's because she's perpetually drawn to the chaos of the job, very much in the same way Cary Grant is. And they find the same chaos in themselves. There is something a little deeper to this movie, and there is some significance here in the way the characters are built and developed and presented. That kind of goes into the psychology of how certain people, well, actually all of us, kind of get so used to certain ways of existing and certain anxiety levels and certain levels of chaos or stimulation that we become addicted to it in a sense. So you'd think that everybody would seek out relaxation and ease and comfort and pleasure. But some people just get too used to being anxious and busy and over the top excited all the time. And that becomes their normal state. And anything away from that gives them anxiety. They almost become addicted to it. And you see that compulsion kind of drive both these characters. And they find that both in their job and in each other. And that's super interesting from a character development standpoint. Like they can't quit each other. They're addicted.
Yeah.
So it kind of drives the whole plot.
You could almost say that the only reason she divorced him was just to make it more exciting and to make this whole thing happen, to give her something
Honestly,
more exciting.
they're that level of toxic, so I believe it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and speaking of like the flip side of a story that's very similar but would be completely different if it was tragic, like you could double feature this with Ace in the Hole, and it would be kind of a perfect comedy tragedy pairing.
Oh, but both about newspapermen?
They're both about exploiting someone for the newspaper. So you have like the sad sack in the prison cell that all the newspapermen are trying to exploit. And you have the guy who's stuck in the mine shaft that is getting exploited. It's just one of them has a lot of jokes around it. And one of them is like a tragic tragedy of self. I love the opening title of this film, where it's like, it all happened in the dark ages of the newspaper game, when a reporter getting that story justified anything short of murder. Incidentally, you will see in this picture no resemblance to the men and women of the press today. Ready? It's like calling the shots right out the gate.
Yeah, it's a fun way to open the movie, that's for sure. They play with the truth a lot in this movie, which is part of the theme. And part of the thing they're doing. One of my favorite moments in the movie is actually right after he's caught finally from the desk, and all of the reporters sit down at their desk to call in their headlines to their various papers, and every single one's version of events is wildly different.
Yeah. I guess we should mention that this is technically a love triangle movie because there is technically another man in the film. But
he's kind of there.
Pretty insignificant. Cary Grant spends the whole time trying to put him in jail, just to keep him out of the way, which is it provides a fun kind of running gag where every time he gets out of a situation, and he's also the altogether too truthful and innocent kind of guy, and so every time Cary Grant sets him up for something, he's just completely baffled, and then he gets out, and then Cary Grant has to put him back in jail for something.
Yeah, it's kind of a nice running gag. It's a good use of the movie's ability to cross time and space in ways that stage plays can't.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to almost a full 2 decades later, Some Like It Hot from 1959 by the protege of Ernst Lubitsch, Billy Wilder himself. Jason, set it up.
Some Like It Hot from 1959. In Prohibition-era Chicago, two musicians, Joe and Jerry, accidentally witness mafia boss Spats Colombo, the owner of the speakeasy they perform at, gunning down an informant on St. Valentine's Day. Eager to escape town, they join an all-female band headed to Florida by train disguised in drag as Josephine and Daphne. On the way, they befriend the band's vocalist and ukulele player Sugarcane, and both men begin competing for her affection, while struggling to maintain their disguises. Sugar confides to Josephine that she hopes to marry a millionaire in Florida and settle down because she always falls for saxophonists and ends up heartbroken. Once in Miami, Joe, the saxophone player, pretends to be a millionaire to woo Sugar, while Jerry, as Daphne, attracts the attentions of an actual millionaire who won't take no for an answer. and Spats Columbo arrives at the same resort the girls are performing at and gets into a spat of his own with the local Miami mafia.
Yeah, this one is interesting just because it is at that tail end of the era. Like, honestly, a lot of movies that were coming out in 1959 were already in color, especially a lot of comedies.
I was thinking about that.
So it's kind of odd that this one isn't in color.
It makes it a very specific choice.
It does. It does. I think it kind of plays up the dynamic between Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis quite a bit into kind of like that screwball sort of dynamic. And it kind of fits in nicely with the rest of the episode too, which is cool. Like visually, it's still very, very much there. I will say, honestly, one of the most out of place parts of it for it being a screwball is the female lead, is Marilyn Monroe. And it's just because she's not talking as fast and as witty as the rest of the characters are. She has some good lines in here for sure, and she has some good acting, but I think it's just part of the typecast of being part of being Marilyn Monroe that doesn't quite fit in line with the other female leads we've seen in screwball comedies. In the two movies we've talked about today, plus other ones like It Happened One Night, or Bringing Up Baby with like Katharine Hepburn, that are just very different.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because if we go back to our unofficial Wikipedia definition, where it talks about a female character who dominates the relationship with the male central character whose masculinity is challenged, and we haven't fully seen that. Like the female character isn't always trying to dominate necessarily, but it's usually a pretty strong female character who sticks up for herself and can at least kind of go toe to toe with the male lead. Like Trouble in Paradise, he's kind of being torn back and forth. He's not controlling the situation, but he just kind of wants to have the best of both worlds and has to decide that he can't. His Girl Friday, Hildy can go toe to toe with Cary Grant's character, even though she ultimately wants to be back with him. But yeah, Marilyn Monroe's character here is not forceful, not domineering, and she kind of just becomes a pawn, or like, for lack of a better word, like the trophy that the two guys are going for. And she's self-deprecating too, which is weird. But ultimately, I think that part of what the strong female character was in these old films was a way to, like we said, challenge the male character's masculinity. But I think in Some Like It Hot, their masculinity is being challenged enough by the situation that the female character doesn't have to play a role in that necessarily. But it does kind of lose something by not having a strong, like, super... Well, she is pretty self-aware, but she's not very... She says herself that she like falls into this rut. She has this routine, which I think helps a little bit because we do have that element of manipulation going on where Tony Curtis's character knows the whole situation and is driving it towards a specific outcome. But it helps to not feel so manipulative in the fact that Marilyn Monroe's character has already said that this is a pattern that she falls into time and time again. So we already know that that's what's going to happen. It's just a matter of getting there.
Yeah. Yeah. And most of what we're seeing there is one, this is kind of past the era of the screwball a little bit. So it's a comedy with a lot of screwball in it, but it's not necessarily part of the peak screwball era. So it's got some other elements to it. It's kind of got a bit of a buddy comedy thing going on, which is starting to emerge in this era. Yeah. There's a love triangle like there was in Trouble in Paradise, but I wouldn't call it romantic. This is very lust motivated and not very love motivated.
That's true. Again, playing with that, like it's not taking the romance seriously like a regular rom-com would.
Yeah. And this is a problem that Marilyn Monroe ran into throughout her career, especially once she became famous and was trying to get more serious roles, was that she would constantly be typecast as the same person. Kind of like the guy we're talking about who's I feel bad. I don't know the actor's name off the top of my head, but he was the buddy and the sad sack in all of the Fred Astaire and Ginger Roger movies. And he was in Trouble in Paradise again, as kind of the sad sack. But Marilyn Monroe would be cast as the dumb sex bomb blonde in like almost every movie she'd ever be in. And she wasn't expected to be witty. She was almost expected to just kind of be like a thing on screen. And that's how she's used in this movie to a major extent. And you know what? There are some scenes in this this movie where she makes a really, really strong contribution to the comedy. Is very, very funny. But there's also a lot of scenes where she's just kind of there to be seen as part of the scene, and for Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon to do jokes around them. Yes, those scenes, very much those scenes. Which talking about non sequitur, like you understand that it's set up over the span of the movie, but it also feels like let's pause and watch a Marilyn Monroe music video for a few minutes and then go back to our regularly scheduled program, which isn't terrible, but it is a little undiegetic.
Yeah. And those scenes are not like, they are not subtle, man.
No. They know what they're doing.
Yeah. Although this is kind of after the I guess golden age of the screwball comedies, we've talked about before in our Billy Wilder episode that Billy Wilder came up under the tutelage of Ernst Lubitsch. So he pulls in a lot of those Lubitsch touches into his films. And a lot of that is on display here. So we have like, first of all, I think it's fun that there's that bus film trope, which is its own kind of sub category. Like It Happened One Night, and films that just like involve a travel sequence for whatever reason. But there's a lot of we have Marilyn Monroe. We've established that, but there's also a lot of innuendo. The whole like no pastries back and forth is just so on the nose. Where one of them, where Jack Lemmon's like, I had this dream that I was in this donut shop and there were donuts and pastries and cream puffs. And he's like, no pastries. Okay. That's as soon as they get on the bus with all the women. There's a scene where Marilyn Monroe kisses Tony Curtis and like his foot rises up behind her head in the frame. There's a lot of things that are even less subtle than Ernst Lubitsch did.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, they knew what they were selling.
Yeah. But that's also one of the reasons why this film is actually credited as being one of the final nails in the coffin of the production code. Which had been weakening for years prior to this, but this film and some of the other films that had been coming out around that time were finally like, all right, you guys win. We can't keep this code going because you're just gonna get right up to that edge even more and more and more. And then eventually in the next couple of years, it turns into the MPAA rating system. But it is interesting to see where all that's coming from in this film. And I think that one thing is interesting in this movie is that there's a lot of romantic deviance displayed, but in a way that's very tongue-in-cheek. So, and Ernst Lubitsch did this a lot too. Like, I watched Design for Living this time, which I hadn't seen before. And Design for Living is also not subtle, although technically pre-code. But in Some Like It Hot, there's things like when Jack Lemmon starts getting hit on by Osgood, and then he realizes, hey, if I married this guy, I could be rich. And Tony Curtis has to remind him, you're a boy, just remember. And he says something, he says, I think it's interesting in terms of like having this film being watched by a moral committee, that Tony Curtis says, not, it would be wrong for you to marry him, but it's not being done. And he's like, you can't marry him. It's just not being done. And it's a very subtle kind of a way of putting it, but it definitely shows the way that they're playing with the taboos in this film. And of course, the very last line of the film plays with that as well. But
that's what I was going to say. It's such a funny last line in the movie.
Yeah. which it's pretty famous. But the last line of the film is the millionaire that's been hitting on Jack Lemmon. They're like riding away in his speedboat, and Jack Lemmon hasn't had the heart to tell him that he's not a lady, and so he's trying to like let him down easy. And this millionaire is just like so excited to be running away with her, and so he's like, I smoke all the time. He's like, oh, that's fine. He's I don't remember all the things that he says, and he's like, oh, I'm a man. And the millionaire's like, well, nobody's perfect. And they just like, they ride off into the sunset, basically. But yeah, it's these little things that don't technically cross a line, but they're playing with those norms and those taboos.
Yeah, it's really funny. Honestly, it's just pretty funny. It kind of gets in those ideas of the dodging the production code that earlier screwballs were doing as well. I think I don't even remember exactly when the production code fell apart, but it was around this time. It was
right after this.
Yeah. It was basically already done. TV really killed it. That and the booming post-World War II economy, when everyone had too much money to worry about morals or what other people's morals should be. So everyone was just having fun. Honestly, I think about this way too much. The duration of the post-World War II boom that lasted like ostensibly from the end of World War II until the Great Recession in like 2007 really skewed the perception of the world of everybody who lived and grew up in it. And I think a big part, it was like the economy on easy mode for like 6-7 decades. Like everything was so good, like over the top good, especially, and obviously this is an American centric view, and for the second half of that also a European centric view, but like, and you see it leak into the movies as well, where everything is just so relaxed. Like look at the concerns of the people in this movie, Jonathan. Like, okay, sure, they had a really dramatic like background. They witnessed basically the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and they're on the run, worried for their life. But they're not living a bad life. Sure, they're in debt, but they're basically on a beach with a hot blonde. They're not doing bad. Look at a similar movie from 1959 from like France. It's depressing as hell. It's just a totally different world to exist in for decades and decades and decades. And now I think that's probably come to an end. And so our experience of reality shifted so dramatically. But yeah, that all is to say that, you know, this took place in a certain era with certain concerns, and those concerns are very different than Great Depression 1930s.
Yeah. I mean, we did look at many films from France from 1959 and 1960 just a few months ago, and they were very depressing.
Yes, they were. I had to get some of them on Blu-ray, Jonathan, in order to watch them, and now I just have these movies, and whenever I want to watch a movie on DVD or Blu-ray, I look at the movies and I'm like, why would I want to watch that right now? Why do I have this?
Yeah, some of them are, you gotta be in some kind of mood for them. I don't know what kind of mood you need to be in to just like, yeah, let's put Le Beau Serge in. So I think that's an interesting transition that we see from the beginning of the screwball comedies, when we have like Great Depression concerns and we're doing class comedy, to Some Like It Hot, where our biggest concern is, like you said, sitting on a beach with a hot blonde, and trying to figure out where we're going to get a yacht from. But
yeah, for two guys on the run for their life, they're not doing bad.
They're not doing bad. But the main trope of this film, the disguises, the masquerade, the cross-dressing, is also a pretty classic just general comedy trope, like going back to Shakespeare. But they take this masquerade up to 11 in this film. We have the double masquerade of Tony Curtis being both, I don't know which of the ladies he is, Geraldine, and the fake rich millionaire with his freaking Cary Grant impression.
Yeah, I thought that was really funny that we did a Cary Grant movie in the same week that we watched Some Like It Hot.
Yeah, it's like I think I would have just thought it was weird if I hadn't just watched that movie. Like, I've seen a lot of Cary Grant films, but having just watched His Girl Friday, you're like, he's just straight up ripping off Cary Grant, and he's doing a pretty good job. It just feels so out of place when the rest of the cast has dropped their transatlantic accent.
Yeah, I mean, hey, even at this point, it's one of the things that I think really marks this is slightly removed from the screwball era is the fact that it can reference the screwball era.
That's true. Yeah.
It kind of makes it kind of demarcates it as an homage to the screwball era. A very, very recent and
Direct
chronologically connected, temporarily not very displaced reference to it, but still like it kind of almost marks the end of it in a sense, I think.
Yeah, but it's a really good kind of cap on the main golden age of screwball comedies. But yeah, with that, let's transition to overall and talk about the whole of these screwball comedies that we've looked at, because screwballs kind of have continued in little pockets here and there. But I think it's really interesting that we don't use it as so much of a modern category, which has been taking the place with more traditional rom-coms and stuff like that. And again, I think one of the key differences between the traditional rom-com and the screwball comedy is a really screwball character or a screwball kind of situation. So you've got a bunch of straight guys in drag in a bus full of women. You've got the fast-talking manipulative reporter, or you've got the master thief trying to work his way into the affections of a rich heiress. So a lot of times I feel like there was a shift towards like more everyman romance comedies. So like even when we covered a bunch of Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan films, like those are very kind of traditional rom-coms that may have some screwball elements to them, but they don't come out as strongly as this pocket of them. But there are a couple of ones that stand out that came afterwards, like Peter Bogdanovich's What's Up, Doc is a great example of a late post-golden age of screwball comedy. But that's also because Peter Bogdanovich spent a lot of time.
Homage to it, yeah.
It's an homage, and Peter Bogdanovich spent a lot of time talking to the people who were making these actual films, and he was kind of in their head a little bit. So that was kind of a unique case, but it's a really good example.
I think, too, when you're looking at the end of screwballs specifically, I think you're seeing two major effects that I can think of, at least, that kind of exist in the broader spectrum of entertainment and film, and specifically, I think one, and this we talked about this with the boom of screwballs, is the idea that, in 1932, the idea of listening to actors on screen pre-recorded was novel and new and fresh.
Yeah.
And in 1959, it's not. That's almost 30 years. People who grew up with screwballs are now full adults with kids. And it just listening to people talk 1,000 miles an hour isn't that exciting. Plus, you have TV. You have that constantly going in your home. You don't necessarily your taste for and excitement for that style is not what it was in 1932. The second thing, and this actually connects to again the new wave series we did, but also the broader effect of the new wave, like the American new wave and what movies became in America and the West in the 60s and the 70s, where movies very specifically kind of stopped being just entertainment and moved directly into the world of art. Not that movies made before the 1960s or 70s weren't art in a sense, but that movies were very consciously made with artistic criteria involved. And so you see an appeal to something very different. It's not just movies that are for entertainment. That is to say,
films are being made with auteur theory front of mind.
Yes. So you see people put effort into shots and timing and spacing. And I think the
which was
use of
being done
negative,
because that's why auteur theory came about. But
yes,
auteur theory hadn't become like a codified thing until the 60s.
one of the big things that auteur theory focuses on is looking, and almost like this voyeuristic quality of cinema and what's being shown and what's not being shown, and what can you convey with showing and not telling. And you know what telling is? A lot of frickin' dialogue. So you kind of see movies almost in a sense, at least when you compare them to screwball comedies, get quieter in the 60s and the 70s and slower, unless you're doing something like a big over-the-top musical. But you see them get quieter and a lot more negative space come into the movies, which is funny because now I think it's almost swinging back the other way, where it is kind of becoming audio focused and fast paced focused. And I think we almost hit the nail on the head earlier in the podcast, Jonathan, where we talked about how, our attentions are split in so many different directions at once, whether there's too much content for you to consume and everyone and every ad you see screaming at you to consume all of it, or the fact that you're trying to balance an ungodly amount of responsibilities that we somehow managed to stack up in our adult lives with also finding time to somehow fulfill your obligation to consume all the most important media that is current, listening to stuff in the background. And so you're not paying attention to it, and the visual and the auteur is slipping away. And instead we have fast-paced comedy and quips and pop culture references that you don't need to really think about, unlike the screwball innuendo. So I think something's lost in the more modern version of it, but you can kind of see, and I think we've seen this in other ways too throughout our study of cinema, but the trends of cinema kind of move in cycles. They come and they go. They come and they go. Almost like how Westerns came and went and came and went and came and went. And each time with a little extra layer on it.
Yeah, and I think there's another element too that we see in this transition, especially the production code is a big thing when we're talking about film history. And that's why I'm bringing it up so much. But like as the production code starts to weaken, and I think... And as, film gets established, like you said, we get used to hearing dialogue, so we're not just satisfied with the verbal interest and stuff like that. So, but there's definitely a shift when we're looking at Trouble in Paradise and Some Like It Hot. There's a shift from, the shot I mentioned before, where you have 3 shots in succession of the characters and the bed in frame, where they're just standing there, to Marilyn Monroe on screen. Like there's an appetite for visually showing more as we get away from the production code. And once that production code completely crumbles, you can show almost anything that you want. And so that completely changes the direction and the tone of what the comedies look like after that. And that's what we're going to kind of start talking about next time. It's like, what happens when you have no restrictions anymore? Things get a little crazy. So that's definitely part of this whole transition, I think, is that shift from just dialogue to like, let's add some more visual interest to get things going. And we're not having to imply, we're not having to do innuendos anymore because we can just show it. Like I saw a list of screwball comedies on Wikipedia that like went through to the modern day. And now I haven't seen this film, so I can't say specifically, but Honora was the last film on the list. And from what I understand, there's not a lot of implying in Honora. And I don't imagine that it's fits into a very classical definition of screwball comedy.
I have no idea what that movie is. I'm going to be completely honest with you, but I believe you. And certainly with what you're talking about there, like in the late 60s, early 70s is kind of when the era of the sexploitation comedy kind of comes into place, where they just show everything.
Yeah.
There's not even the thinly veiled shots and innuendo surrounding Marilyn Monroe. Those seem chaste in comparison to the era of the teenage romp comedy that kind of heightens in the 70s and the early 80s. But yeah, it definitely changes. It changes. You lose something, and there's some, censorship is not necessarily a positive, but there is something to the artistic quality of restraining yourself from showing. Yeah,
there's creativity
everything.
And restraint.
But that is, you can't always control those things. So where that it doesn't exist, you'll have both. And obviously, during those eras, it's not like everybody started doing that. There are still excellent comedies from that era of all sorts of types, from all sorts of places that kind of toe the line in different ways. It's just that the technique becomes less prevalent because it doesn't have to exist in the same way.
Yeah.
And also, like the novelty that we were talking about with dialogue becoming a big thing in the early 30s, novelty is a big thing. Something is new. Everyone's going to hop on the train. It's new. It's fresh. It's exciting. Humans have a weird bias towards newness at the same time that we have a bias against change. We're strange like that. But so it goes.
Yeah. And I do want to bring up a couple of these contrasts between like the subtle difference between these classic screwball comedies and also golden age tragedies. Like the difference between the 39 Steps and It Happened One Night is a very subtle difference because it's still like two characters kind of more or less locked together, exchanging quippy dialogue and stuff like that. It's just the 39 Steps takes its plot a little more seriously. And I think that's part of what the crime element of all three of these films that we picked for this week does is it adds a little bit of like actual stakes to the stories. So there's at least a chance that someone could get caught or arrested or gunned down by the mafia or something like that. So it adds a little bit of gravitas into the story. But again, the difference is with the tone of the dialogue and the jokes and stuff like that, you're pretty sure no one's going to like die. I mean, except for a lady who just jumps out the window all of a sudden, but nothing seriously bad is going to happen to our main characters. Whereas in the 39 Steps, there could be something more tragic that happens. Or like we said, the difference between Ace in the Hole and His Girl Friday, very subtle difference. Even Some Like It Hot, which is almost just straight, it's like got a lot of those gangster things going on, and we have a literal massacre at the beginning of the film. But that's not the focus of the film. The focus is the comedic aspects. But we do get some carryover with that in modern films, like a lot of modern buddy cop films kind of do the same thing, and stuff like that. But this was a kind of interesting period where we had a lot of these really specific traits that all lined up to make the quote unquote screwball comedy that kind of dissipates after this period. And after this period, like I said, the production code starts to completely fall away. We can do whatever we want. And so the next period of films is what we're calling like absurdist comedies, because once you can show everything,
Jonathan, that's absurd.
People start showing some weird things. So what are the weird and absurd things we're going to be talking about next time?
Well, Jonathan, this just in, the hottest news in town. Next time on the Filmlings, we'll be talking about The Producers from 1967. Then we'll be talking about Airplane from 1980. And finally, The Mask from 1994. And a little fun fact, Jonathan, every time my dog drinks water, she always coughs a little bit of it up. And I look at her and I go, "When did your drinking problem start?" And she looks at me and says, "Don't call me Shirley."
There you have it. You heard it here first, folks. Last thing before we go, I do want to say that we have a lot of related episodes to this one. So if you're interested in any of this kind of stuff, we have a whole episode on Ernst Lubitsch. We have a whole episode on Billy Wilder. We have a whole episode on Frank Capra, who did It Happened One Night. A whole episode on Peter Bogdanovich. Links to all of those will be in the show notes. But yeah, we've talked about screwball comedies a lot because they're a really great genre, and they made a lot of them. Like, it was just a couple decades, but they made so many of them, and they're all pretty darn good.
Oh man, we got so many episodes. You guys should go listen to them all. All of them. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 516 films we have covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
We have some people joining us on our Discord server today, listening live. Very fun.
Is the Discord server in the room with us right now? Is it behind me?
The Discord server is coming from inside the house.
Dun, dun, dun.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us at the Filmlings.
Summaries for this episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover everything I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. One thing that I really like about the dialogue in this film, in terms of its use as a...
Jonathan, we don't have time to dialogue a different color. We have to record a podcast.
Dialogue a different color? What?
Yes, like when you get the bottle of shampoo for your hair that turns it blue. Dialogue.
I'm not ready. I'm not on your level.
Sorry, Jonathan.
today.
Did I hit you with a screwball?
That was the screwball for sure.
For anybody who's wondering why the energy level is different, I just finished my work week and I work nights. And Jonathan just woke up.
Yeah.
So I'm relaxed and fully awake, and Jonathan is the opposite of those things.
I'm not done with my first cup of coffee yet. Give me a minute. Dialogue. Okay.
Dialogue. Like a log, like off of a tree.
Dialogue.
Dialogue. Dialogue.
All right.
That really messed you up, man. I'm sorry.